Oh, hello, everyone. So my name is Jenny Kylmäkoski, and I have the privilege to present you the next speaker, our first speaker. So Amir Elkabir comes from Israel, and he works currently as a program manager at AT&T in the entertainment section. In his past, Amir said that he has worked in many different roles in fintech and semiconductor industries. So he has worked with many engineers in the companies that have lots of different cultures and lots of different sites all around the sun. Amir likes to share his knowledge frequently, and he's, for example, part of the Agile at Scale in Israel. He's also a guest panel advisor in MBA program in Israel Institute of Technology. And also he's a founder of the Project Management Guild in AT&T. Amir's presentation is our safe journey to follow the sun. So this is a story about how to transform many sites all around the world to follow agile way of working. Amir told me that he has loads of stories to tell you about, but only 30 minutes of time. So let's hope that still he's able to give us some good hints how this all has been made possible. So Amir, welcome to the stage.
Here I am. Hello, everyone. Hello, Jenny. How are you doing?
How are you?
I'm very good these days.
Good.
Waiting to start and share this presentation, share this story with you all. And it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. So can you, I will check out that we can see your presentation.
Oh, you want me to share? Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Just a second.
Then I leave and leave you on the stage.
Just 1 minute.
Getting something good. I think we're good to go, and hopefully all the audience will also see Amir's presentation.
Where everyone can see. So you can see this presentation right now, yeah?
Yes, I can see it. So
okay,
and then they can see. So the stage is yours.
Thank you so very much. And wow, this is a great privilege to be opening this day here today and this event. I sure hope I could have met all of you in person, which I planned to last month, but hey, at least we're here. And this is going to be a great online event, and this is our safe journey to follow the sun. Now, I'm willing to bet that if I show you this piece of furniture right here, most of you are going to find it very familiar, right? So if you happen to grow up in the 1980s, as I did, this piece of furniture right here was very common in people's homes. It was common in my home. It was common in my friends' homes. And I'm, of course, talking about the computers of International Business Machines Corporation, also known as IBM. Now, very few know this, but in the mid-1980s, IBM was the biggest software company in the world, bigger than everybody else, bigger than Microsoft, Compaq, Sun Microsystems, all of those. And throughout the 80s, nearing the 90s, the competitive landscape around the world started to change, and lots of competition started to come up. Hundreds and thousands of new competitors came up, all of them much smaller, much leaner, much more adaptive to the ever-changing world around them. And IBM, having its size and global presence, and with a lack of proper vision and strategy, the size became its biggest disadvantage as well. And so in the beginning of the 1990s, the board of directors kind of showed CEO of IBM, John Akers, the way out. And they went searching for a new CEO to march IBM into the new decade. Went around looking, which eventually came down to this man, Lou Gerstner, who was parachuted to the CEO chair of IBM on April of 1993. And whom later was known as probably the best CEO IBM had ever had. Now, Lou, he had a different vision. He said, well, if we could only leverage the size and global presence of IBM and leverage that into our advantage, an advantage that nobody else could have. And what Lou said was, we must have one site somewhere in the world that's finishing their working day. They're going to sleep right now. And at the same time, we must have another site waking up, stepping into their office, starting their working day. And if we only could handshake effectively, Lou said, between the two sites, then we could really leverage this follow the sun model of work. The term follow the sun started to cascade into the organization, and it was eventually embraced and followed by other corporates and organizations around the world. So I pause here and then I fast forward 30 years later to our time today. Many things have changed, and in particularly we have changed, right? The way we communicate, the magnitude of communication we have internet now, social media, and the way we develop software. We want to be much more adaptive to client changes. We want to be much quicker and ship new versions and software into production much more frequently. But the question remains, how can large organizations and corporates leverage their size and their global presence in all the different time zones while practicing Agile at very large scale, all at the same time? And so with that, I'd like to share a little story with you. And this story is about people and how we at AT&T, the Israel side, have been able to leverage our global presence and size while communicating very effectively from very far away. Now, the story begins about 3 years ago when my team and I were asked to join a global effort for shaping the future of how Americans consume entertainment. A flagship project at the time and one of the biggest projects that the entertainment group at AT&T had ever kicked off. So we kick this off, we onboard all the sites, we start rolling, and we quickly grew to over 1,000 people on the program, working at 5 different global locations, from Los Angeles in the West, all the way through Tel Aviv in the East, where I'm based out of. Many other sites, all the way in between, like Toronto, New Jersey, Tampa, Dallas, and others. We were spread across 7 Agile release trains with 70 Scrum and Kanban teams, working all at 10 different time zone areas, shipping a new version into production every 2 weeks, literally at the end of each sprint. Now, I will let you so-call this in because this is the magnitude of scale, and this is the complexity that we had to work in. This is what we needed to ramp up and start operating. And that's a huge operation that's very global. Now, the question is that I want to ask you is, how do you think this all went for us? How do you think you can ramp up and start rolling this? And the short answer to that question is it was a disaster. It was really, really tough to start operating effectively, at least in the first few months. You can imagine that while our colleagues stepped into their office, 9 a.m. in the morning, Los Angeles time, zipping their first cup of coffee, our folks were already having dinner with their families back home, zipping on their first glass of wine after a full working day. It was impossible to conduct any mutual ceremonies this way. And not only that, our developers, they were coding and programming the exact same code areas, the exact same code lines, either amending or erasing each other's work and refactoring each other's work. Sometimes the other way around, duplicating each other's work. With 2 developers, we've had that numerous cases, programming the same functionalities without knowing about one another, all at the same program. And the lack of personal relations and lack of communication, that did not make it any easier on us, any much easier on the way we worked. We were totally reliant on overseas. The infrastructure and the environments teams, those were ramped up in West Coast US. So imagine now a group or a team having in Toronto an issue with their CI/CD pipeline. They're quite reliant on somebody from West Coast US. Now, not to mention our folks and teams in Europe and in the Middle East, in Israel. So this teams are being reliant so much on overseas, that make it very difficult for us. We were onboarded like sub-organizations, not really interacting with one another, and it was impossible to kind of follow all the corridor conversations going on. Now, that's extremely important in Agile-driven organizations in particularly. So you can imagine, I'm sure you all came here today as well, not just to look at the speakers and listen to the speakers talk. You came for the breaks. You came to interact with one another, have some interesting hallway conversations with one another. So we could not have all of that. Where do you think all the interesting ad hoc conversations and decision-making meetings take place? And I'll give you a hint. It's not in the meeting rooms. It's probably right here. It's next to the cooler. It's next to the coffee corner. It's when you bump into each other in the corridors and have some interesting corridor conversations. And so everything I've just described to you, this all had a very direct impact on our project. Our velocity was poor, team's morale was low, and the work-life balance became unbearable. We have literally spent nights after nights sitting at home in our living rooms, attending video calls, looking something like that. So with the last couple of months, I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about, but imagine this becomes your day-to-day life, your entire team's day-to-day life. That's really unbearable. But folks, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, so we had to crack this nut open and make it work. But all we needed was the right approach. An approach to turn all those disadvantages of size, of distance, of different time zones and cultures into our advantage. So we went ahead and we focused on all of those key areas that if we tackle those, we could probably just make it. And between now and the rest of this talk, I'd like to walk you through those 5 key areas and the best practices we've applied so that in exactly 20 minutes from now, if you can at least go back to your organization and at least apply some of those quick wins and get some really good results out of those. And the first is the ceremonies. Unite the ceremony, start acting as one global team. The second key area, the teams, in the sense of allowing them to be autonomous, but at the same time in sync. Some best practices for running and managing remote teams, a smarter way for backlog management when you have distributed teams, and we'll talk about that. And of course, some best practices for communication when communicating overseas. So the first area, the ceremonies. We've decided to meet all the key stakeholders and the program managers in the different sites, and we've mapped all the ceremonies we had, local ceremonies on the left, global on the right. And we've decided we're going to run only these ceremonies, not more, not less. And the daily stand-ups and the team retrospectives, for example, the teams run those locally, each side on its own. But the end of sprint system demos, we've decided to run those together globally. And you can see the little icon next to it because we've decided we're going to also open cameras and run those in WebEx and Telepresence. And the long-term PI planning, we've actually physically met. And every 10 weeks, we've actually met on one global location. Not everybody, there's constraints and budget and all of that, but representatives from the different teams, they served as liaisons. So it is this level of detail that we went into when defining our local and global ceremonies. The next thing that we did is we've decided to humanize as much of our ceremonies as possible. Now, this was originally a short video, a 10-second video, but since we're online, it will only be an image. But this is an image of one of our Scrum teams, actual Scrum teams in our site. And they're currently running a fist to 5 or confidence vote ceremony that we conduct every time we do planning. And so instead of sending our colleagues abroad a one-liner email saying, done, we've done it, we're not sending anything at all, we've actually videotaped our team. It takes exactly 15 seconds and it makes all the difference. And this exact video was sent across to our colleagues, and they could see the faces and the people behind the ceremony and behind the team. And this really creates this engagement and bonding you want to create. And the third thing we did in terms of ceremonies, we did not leave any of our teams aside, everyone gets represented. So on the right here, you can see Jerry, one of our RTEs from LA, and he's holding a big physical board with all the tasks that his art has and the different dependencies on the strings. But on the left, you can see a virtual board. So all the remote teams, we've created some virtual boards for them, and they can upload their and populate their tasks and their dependencies and risks and send that over to Jerry and the rest of the RTEs. And the RTEs would populate that onto the physical board so that at any given time, all the teams, remote, local, distributed, everyone, they all get represented. So I'd like to wrap this part up and share the key learnings and key takeaways from what we've just discussed. So first of all, map the ceremonies, agree on them with your co-workers abroad, and map them into local and global. Humanize the ceremonies as much as you can. We're humans at the end of the day. So send videotapes. That's one quick tip, but there's other means to do that. And all the teams get represented, nobody gets left out. The next area we went ahead and tackled are the teams. And in the sense of allowing them to be as autonomous and with as minimal dependencies overseas as possible. So we have identified all of those areas and key SME experts that we needed to allow our teams to run smoothly during their day. I'm talking about tier 3 support and DevOps and CI/CD pipeline support, for example. Now there will be a slight overhead to that because there's particular teams abroad ramped up exactly for that. But we've found out that there are particular SMEs that it's worthwhile onboarding to allow your teams to run smoothly in their language and their local time zone as well. But at the same time that we wanted our teams to be autonomous, we also wanted them to be in sync. And we did that by modeling what we call sister teams. So if you look at the example on the left with the co-located teams, so we have a feature built by one Scrum team in one location. That's easy, that's a no-brainer, right? But what if we have a feature built by several Scrum teams, 2 in this case? So what we did is we've defined a local troika and the remote troika. And now the troika is 3 roles. It's the PO, the architect, and the Scrum Master of the team. So we had one troika, the local here, oversighting the entire feature. But then we had a remote troika sitting alongside each of their Scrum teams. And this gave us this flexibility of, from one hand, every Scrum had their own troika, Scrum Master and PO, sitting alongside with them in the same time zone and language. But we also did not have to get all the team members on all the calls all the time. We just needed the troikas to be in sync. And we improved the work-life balance of our teams in staying in sync. And the third thing we did is we've onboarded project management and project managers. Now, I'm very well aware to this debate about project management in agile organizations, yes or no, but we came to the conclusion that there's 2 conditions that if you meet those, or if we meet those, we just have to have project management, and that's when you scale and when you go global. So we've met those 2 conditions. We scaled and we went global. So we've onboarded this project management in all the different sites to oversight and take responsibility for these main areas: team synchronization, serving as outbound liaisons, attending Scrum of Scrum, for example, and liaisoning with the third-party vendors, tracking deliveries and tracking the milestones of the PI plannings, and gluing this whole group together, making sure the global ceremonies happen, they happen on time, and all the tools are used, they are aligned and in sync. So I'm going ahead and wrapping up the learnings from the teams and the key takeaways that you can already take and apply. Autonomous teams, minimal dependencies for every one of your teams on overseas, but at the same time, get them in sync. The method we used was to model the sister teams. And the third key practice was project managers. When you meet 2 conditions, when you go global and when you scale up. So moving on to the third key area, we went ahead and we tackled some best practices for managing remote teams. And the first best practice was to conduct mutual code reviews between developers, but not just two developers, between sites. So if a developer would check in a code into master branch, we'd had another developer from their same platform on the other side of the world in some other site approve that code for them. So not only did our developers stop erasing each other's code, but they approved each other's code. And this is essentially the foundations for the follow the sun model of work, because now our developers kind of know the big picture and they can support and back up each other on different time zones, on each other's weekends and each other's holidays. They can provide the first triage if something happens in production. Another best practice is the COPs, or Development Community of Practices. So we've established those on the platform level. So for example, the Android developers, they had a community on a global spread, and the backend developers, and so did the web developers. And now we had every developer not only being part of a local Scrum team, but they were part of a global community. And that really bonded between the developers, and it created this personal relationships between them and what we wanted to do. And they ran their own Slack channel, and they met on a weekly basis to share information and knowledge with one another. And we really encouraged that to happen. And a third key practice for managing remote teams is what we call the handover emails. So here you can see an exact template, a real template that we've used, where location A sends location B at the end of their working day a handover email. That's the template that we use. So it would we would share the version number, we would share what was accomplished, but most importantly, down on the bottom, what location A expects the other site waking up to take forward. Now, site A would come back in the morning, the next morning, to their office. They did not need to dig and look for what has changed in the code, because the exact same template would wait for them in their mailboxes from location B. And so it doesn't really matter if you use handover emails or a different template. The idea is that you should have a mechanism to handshake effectively between your sites to leverage the different time zones onto your advantage. So with that, I'd like to wrap up the key learnings and the key takeaways that you can take away. 3, mutual code reviews between developers, but not just between developers sitting on different sites. The second, invest in development COPs, encourage your developments to have that. And number 3, handover emails. Make sure you handshake effectively between two sites and more. So I'm ready to move to the fourth key area, and we're moving very well. And this one is the backlog management, or a smarter way for backlog management, when taking into consideration that you have remote and distributed teams. Now, I apologize up front to all those POs out there that are listening to me right now, because I'm going to simplify your role for just 1 second, which is to basically make sure your team has a backlog and make sure it's prioritized. But when dealing and managing distributed teams, there's other things not less important to factor in. Now, I'll give you an example, and I'll ask you a question. All of those people from Helsinki, Finland, watching me and listening to me right now, I want to ask you, how's the baseball league going on in Finland right now? How's the baseball league going on? So this is one of those cases where I wish I was there with you to listen to all your answers, but I cannot. So I'll just imagine and hope that it's kind of similar to the baseball league going on in Tel Aviv, Israel right now, which is we do not have a baseball league. And that's exactly the point. So imagine you have a team in Europe or in Israel or somewhere else, and you need to innovate a new way Americans watch baseball, but your remote teams, they know nothing about baseball or the whole baseball Sunday atmosphere going on in the US right now. There's no point in assigning such features over to them if they're not going to have much added value to that, right? There's a big culture gap. And it doesn't really matter how high up in the pile and in the rank that feature will be. But if that's not enough, what about broadcasting rights? What about blackouts? So imagine you're watching a baseball game, but there's broadcasting rights that allow only one part of the nation or one area to watch, and there's blackouts in the other, right? It's usually nation-based, and it's usually on location-based and maybe even city-based. Now, the end-to-end testing of such features, such an example, moreover, the production support of such features later on in production, that's very location-based. So if you have teams abroad that you will know do not or cannot have end-to-end ownership of that feature, all the way from design to development, to delivery, to production support, better off not to assign such features to them. And once again, it doesn't really matter what's the ranking and priority of those features. Need to factor in other things. And so very specific key takeaways that you can take with you and apply in any industry, not just mine. It's from backlog management with remote teams and a distributed multi-site program. It's not just about ranking a priority. There is the end-to-end ownership of every team needs to get features they can own end-to-end and support production. And the other thing is every team needs to add value to those features and understand from a culture perspective, from skills perspective, from any other's perspective, you need to assign such features to them. So we finally come to communication, which is the fifth and last key area we have tackled. And before I dig into this with my key three takeaways, the website is full of know-hows, how to communicate with overseas. So I'll just give you my rule of thumb, which is the more humanized the tools that you use, the better communication you will have. It starts with cameras like we're having right now, and try to jump on ad hoc face-to-face meetings as much as you can. But it's not just about you, because as Agile leaders in our organizations, we do not necessarily need to be the ones creating the communication. We need to encourage others to jump on ad hoc face-to-face meetings as well and establish the conditions for communication to occur in our organization. So, telepresence and video conferencing is one very good example. But we had only two a few years ago in our site now. This is a 700-person site. And what happens when the overlapping begins? Somewhere between 4 p.m. to 7 p.m., between Europe time zone to West Coast US, there would start being literally a queue to the telepresence rooms. So our management and senior management, they understood that and they invested money and budget into that. It's that important. And equipped 15 of our meeting rooms in our site today with high-end telepresence systems. So this is to encourage and allow people to jump on face-to-face meetings whenever they need. A second key practice, this is a very quick win, right? So this is BFF list, and BFF stands, you guessed it right, for best friends forever. You've guessed it right. And this is such a quick win that it's such an easy one to apply and gives so much value back. You can apply it in 5 minutes from now. I had my BFFs, which is a few program managers on the other side of the world. The POs had their BFFs, and the architects and the developers and so on. I made sure I had their personal phone number on my speed dial, and that we feel very comfortable calling each other at Saturday night and Sunday morning and whenever we needed. And now this kind of bypasses the cooler that I showed you earlier, if you remember the cooler. This creates another whole new layer of informal communication between the different sites. You can ask questions and interact kind of off the record when you have BFFs. So identify your key stakeholders abroad. Make sure they have BFFs on your site. And the third key practice is we socialize. Now put that in your mind. Everybody likes to socialize, but not everybody does that. So when you do have the chance to fly around and travel around between your sites. Don't miss the chance to socialize. Do not leave the office at 5 p.m. Go back to your hotel. This particular image, for example, was taken in Chicago, and the gentleman behind me is Tushar, and the gentleman in front of me is Dave, and behind him is Sarah, and so on. So I've made some really good connections and friends. And those friendships, they allowed me to interact and work with all those folks later on. So socialize as much as you can. So the key learnings and key takeaways to apply in any organization, in any industry. Create your BFF list. It's quick and it gives you back lots of value. Use Humanize tools as much as you can. Everybody has a little camera on their laptops today. Open your cameras as much as you can. Fly around if your budget permits. And socialize. Do not forget to socialize and chit chat with one another. Bond between the people from the different sites. And so time is running fast on us. And I'd just like to wrap all this up and kind of let you know, what have we achieved by doing all of that, by applying all these practices? Where has this all taken us about 1 year later into the process? What have we gained? First of all, we've been able to generate a 24/6 delivery machine, literally, not just for production support, for ongoing delivery. Number two, we've been able to leverage some very experienced talents abroad, wherever they sit around the world, make sure we can onboard them and communicate with them seamlessly. And we've been able to generate a one working team atmosphere where all of our ceremonies are unite and all the group members are happy and are proud to take part of this program. And most importantly, our biggest turnaround was that our journey to follow the sun was safe again. I want to thank you so very much, everyone, for listening to me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That was a very inspiring presentation. I can completely agree with you with many of your highlights. We do have some questions in Q&A session. And first, there's a question about, actually, there's two questions. I combine them both. So what are the benefits of the physical board? So the question is also, why RT need to replicate those physical boards? Why not just use the digital one?
Okay. Well, for good time's sakes, I guess, there's not. It's a good question because it is not a must. It's not a must. So this was a story that I shared from my experience, and this is how we used to do things. The RTE used to keep a physical board because there was one location that was kind of the headquarters of this program, and most of the teams and people were there. So they would keep those boards in the corridors. Everybody would kind of pass by and see that. But everybody is everybody on that site, not on different sites. The point is to give all of the teams in the program, no matter where they sit around the world, the opportunity to feel like they're also part of something. It is not just one site is the local site and all the rest need to support that site. Everybody needs to be part of it. Nobody gets left out.
Okay, that's a good answer. Then we have a question from Henry. How do you define the roles of team-level architect in your troikas?
Okay, so an architect or a system architect, we onboarded such a role in our teams. Now, every team has an architect, but not necessarily every architect has one team. So we have some architects that support and work with several Scrum teams, as long as every Scrum team knows who their architect is. There is also, so some teams, if they're very technical, they have an architect that's very involved. There can be other teams that are, they do not work on very technical features or epics. So they may need less time and attention from architects. So we balance that. But we have an architect and a PO and a Scrum Master assigned to each and every Scrum.
Okay. Then we have a question from Christina. So how would you apply these practices in an organization of 15 or even more development teams working in the same product? So really huge products.
Yeah, so what I've just talked about was one product, by the way, and it was 70 teams. And that's the reason we had 7 arts, because I think it's about 10 teams per art, because we used SAFe. But it doesn't really matter if you use SAFe methodology in particularly or some other scaled Agile methodology. That's not the idea. I think I would take away and apply at least most of what I've just explained, because if you say I did not get into any details about the product, or it doesn't really matter if these are teams from a Far East culture or Far West culture. I think this can be applied in any industry, anywhere. And a 15 team program with one product, that sounds quite okay for me to apply at least most of these. I would apply for sure the community of practices that we did for developers. I would have applied most of the communication practices that I've talked about, and in particularly also the backlog management, to factor in not just priorities but other things. I think it's possible.
Okay, good. I think we have still time left for one question, but I'm sure you will be available here in a break, so everybody can ask you privately more questions. But I select one question still. Okay. So Mikko is asking, how did you figure out what kind of COPs, communities of practice, you actually need?
Yeah, the short answer is from a logic perspective. The logic is what has kind of driven us. So we kind of we had the logic of multiple developers working on same platforms that we felt they had something very much in common. The web developers, they all had something very much in common. They had one platform that they needed to ship a version to, and the backend developers had something else in common. Now, if the gentleman asking me the question, or other people, if they have in their organizations another logic, something that combines their developers together, the idea is to have something in common between the developers. Now, if you find that thing in common, then you know that would be a community.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your presentation. Maybe, Mika, if you can share the slides again. So good thing we have now a break coming for around 10 minutes. And then now you have opportunity to discuss with your colleagues or sip a cup of coffee. And then you will be again brought up to this main stadium when the next presentation starts. So thank you, everybody. Let's continue to the break.